Hey everyone, and welcome back to True Crime for Sleep Stories. Each night, we look into real cases that remind us how strange and unpredictable the world can be, but we do it quietly, so you can listen, relax, and maybe drift off while you do. So find a comfortable spot, let your mind slow down, and if you enjoy these calm late-night stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, take a deep breath, and let's begin tonight's case. My name is Dr. Elena Rodriguez, and I was the medical examiner for Santa Fe County, New Mexico, from 1977 to 2003. During those 26 years, I performed thousands of autopsies, documented countless deaths, helped bring closure to families who'd lost loved ones. But one case has stayed with me longer than any other. The unidentified young woman we found on Highway 285 in March 1980. The girl the media called the Santa Fe hitchhiker. I prefer not to use that name. It reduces her to a circumstance, to the act of hitchhiking that may have led to her death, rather than acknowledging she was a person with a life and identity we simply never discovered. But I understand why the name stuck. It was descriptive, memorable, and it captured the transient nature of her existence, at least the part of it we knew about. The call came on March 24th, 1980, a Monday morning around 8:30 a.m. A rancher named Tom Beckworth had been checking fence lines on his property, which bordered Highway 285 about 15 miles north of Santa Fe. He'd noticed something unusual about 50 yards off the highway, partially obscured by juniper bushes and chamisa. When he investigated, he found a body. I arrived at the scene around 10 a.m. along with investigators from the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Department. The location was remote, high desert terrain, sparse vegetation, with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains visible in the distance. Highway 285 was a major route connecting Santa Fe to Espanola and points north, but this particular stretch was isolated, with few buildings or residences nearby. The young woman was lying on her back in a small depression in the ground, partially concealed by brush. She was fully clothed, faded Levi's jeans, a brown corduroy jacket over a white t-shirt, worn hiking boots, and several pieces of turquoise jewelry, a necklace, 2 rings, and earrings. The jewelry appeared to be genuine Navajo or Pueblo silverwork, the kind sold at trading posts throughout New Mexico. She was young, I estimated late teens to early 20s, with long dark hair and features that suggested she might be Native American or Hispanic, though it's difficult to determine ethnicity definitively from physical appearance alone. She'd been deceased for several days, probably 3 to 5, based on the condition of the remains and the ambient temperature during late March. There was no identification on her body, no wallet, no driver's license, no papers of any kind. Her pockets contained only a few dollars in coins, a pack of Marlboro cigarettes, and a book of matches from a truck stop in Albuquerque. The preliminary examination at the scene showed evidence of strangulation, petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, marks on the neck consistent with ligature strangulation. There were no obvious signs of sexual assault based on the condition of her clothing, but I'd need to conduct a full autopsy to determine that conclusively. Back at the medical examiner's office in Santa Fe, I performed the autopsy on March 25th. The cause of death was definitively asphyxiation due to strangulation. She'd been strangled with something like a rope or cord. The ligature marks were consistent with that. The death would have taken several minutes, would not have been quick or easy. There was no evidence of recent sexual assault, though determining that with certainty after several days of decomposition is challenging. She'd eaten a meal of what appeared to be hamburger and French fries several hours before death. She had no defensive wounds on her hands or arms, suggesting she might have been surprised or overpowered quickly, or possibly had been restrained in some way that prevented her from fighting back. She was in generally good health, well nourished, with no signs of chronic illness or drug use. Her teeth showed some dental work, a few fillings, nothing unusual, but the pattern wasn't distinctive enough to make identification easy. I documented everything meticulously, took photographs, collected samples, fingerprinted her, and made detailed notes about every identifying characteristic. She had a small scar on her left knee, about 2 inches long, probably from a childhood injury. She had pierced ears. She was approximately 5'3" tall, weighed about 110 pounds. Her hair was naturally dark brown, shoulder length with no signs of dye or chemical treatment. She wore no makeup. Her fingernails were short, clean, unpolished. The jewelry she wore became a focus of the investigation. The turquoise necklace was particularly distinctive, a squash blossom design with high-quality stones, probably worth several $100s. The rings and earrings were simpler, but also appeared to be genuine Native American craftsmanship. Detective Sarah Montoya from the Sheriff's Department took photographs and began showing them to jewelry dealers and trading posts throughout New Mexico. Several dealers recognized the style as Navajo work, possibly from the Four Corners area, but couldn't identify the specific pieces or remember selling them to anyone matching the young woman's description. Turquoise jewelry was extremely popular in New Mexico in 1980. Thousands of similar pieces circulated through the tourist trade and among locals. Tracing specific items was nearly impossible. Her fingerprints were sent to the FBI and compared against their database. No matches. She'd never been arrested, never been fingerprinted for any official purpose. Her dental records were documented and circulated to dentists throughout the Southwest, hoping someone would recognize the pattern of fillings and dental work. No matches came back. The investigation traced her last known movements through witness reports. Several people came forward after the case was publicized, saying they'd seen or interacted with a young woman matching her description in the days before her body was discovered. A truck driver named Mike Patterson reported picking up a hitchhiker along I-40 near Grants, New Mexico on March 19th, 5 days before the body was found. He described her as matching the victim's description: young, dark hair, wearing jeans and a corduroy jacket, carrying a small backpack. She'd been quiet, hadn't talked much, said she was heading west to California. He dropped her off at a truck stop outside Albuquerque around noon that day. A waitress at that truck stop, Linda Chin, remembered serving a young woman matching the description that same afternoon. The girl had ordered coffee and toast, had sat in a booth for about an hour reading a paperback book. Linda remembered she'd seemed tired, maybe troubled, but polite. She'd left a small tip and walked out toward the parking area. Then on March 20th or 21, the witness wasn't certain of the exact date, a woman named Joyce Henderson reported seeing a young woman matching the victim's description getting into a tan pickup truck on I-25 just south of Santa Fe. Joyce had been driving north and had passed the truck as it pulled back onto the highway. She'd noticed the young woman in the passenger seat because she'd seemed very young, maybe too young to be traveling with the older man who was driving. Joyce described the man as white, possibly in his 40s or 50s, with gray or graying hair, wearing a denim jacket and a baseball cap. She couldn't see the license plate or remember any other identifying details about the truck. It was a common model, Chevy or Ford, she thought, tan or beige, maybe 10 years old. Thousands of similar trucks were on New Mexico roads. That sighting of the tan pickup became the focus of the investigation. Detective Montoya theorized that the young woman had accepted a ride from this man, possibly somewhere along I-25 or Highway 285, and that he'd killed her and dumped her body off the highway north of Santa Fe. The sheriff's department put out bulletins asking for information about tan pickup trucks in the area, about the older man Joyce Henderson had described. They interviewed known sex offenders in northern New Mexico, checked on men who had histories of violence against women, followed up on every tip that came in. But without a license plate number, without a better description, without even knowing if the man in the tan pickup was actually connected to the murder, the investigation stalled. There were hundreds of tan pickup trucks in New Mexico, and the description of the driver was too generic to be useful. The victim's identity remained the other major frustration. Detective Montoya worked tirelessly to figure out who this young woman was. She contacted every police department in New Mexico and surrounding states, asking about missing persons reports that matched the victim's description. She contacted Native American tribes and pueblos throughout the Southwest, asking if anyone had a missing daughter or relative who fit the description. Several missing persons cases seemed possible at first. A 17-year-old Navajo girl named Sharon Begay had disappeared from Shiprock in February 1980. A 19-year-old from Albuquerque named Maria Gutierrez had left home in January and not been seen since. A 21-year-old from Tucson named Jennifer Martinez had vanished in March while traveling through New Mexico. But as each case was investigated, they were ruled out. Sharon Begay was found alive in Phoenix, living with friends. Maria Gutierrez's dental records didn't match our victims. Jennifer Martinez was eventually located in California, unharmed. None of the missing persons cases we investigated turned out to be our victim. That was perhaps the most troubling aspect of the case, that this young woman had died, and apparently no one had reported her missing. Either her family didn't know where she was and didn't realize anything was wrong, or she didn't have family, or her family had reasons not to report her disappearance. The investigation considered the possibility that she might have been a runaway, someone who'd left home voluntarily and whose family either didn't care or didn't know how to find her. The 1970s and early 1980s were peak years for young people hitchhiking across the country, dropping out of conventional society, traveling without clear destinations. Some of them came from troubled homes and didn't maintain contact with families, but even runaways usually left some trail: employment records, school records, interactions with social services. Our victim had none of that, at least nothing we could find. The Santa Fe County Sheriff's Department held a press conference in April 1980, displaying photographs of the victim's face, taken post-mortem but rendered to look as natural as possible, and her distinctive jewelry. The photos were distributed to newspapers and television stations throughout the Southwest. The community was asked to help identify her. Surely someone knew who she was, had seen her, could provide her name. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of tips came in. People called saying the victim looked like their missing daughter, or their niece, or a girl who used to live down the street. Each tip was investigated. Each one led nowhere. Either the person they thought it was turned out to be alive and accounted for, or the physical description didn't actually match when examined closely, or the dental records didn't align. By summer 1980, the active investigation had slowed. We still had no identification, no solid leads on the killer, no real progress despite months of work. The victim was buried in the Santa Fe National Cemetery in June 1980 in a plot donated by a local veterans organization that had been moved by her story. Her headstone read, "Unknown young woman, found March 24th, 1980. Rest in peace." The case remained officially open, but without new evidence or information, there wasn't much to investigate. Detective Montoya would periodically check on it, follow up on occasional tips, compare our victim against new missing persons reports, but year after year, no identification was made. I left the medical examiner's office in 2003, but I kept copies of the Santa Fe hitchhiker's records and photographs. She'd been one of my first major unidentified cases, and her mystery had never left me. Over the years, I'd occasionally take out the file and review it, hoping fresh eyes after time away might reveal something I'd missed. I never found anything new. In the 2000s, DNA technology advanced to the point where we could extract DNA from old evidence and create genetic profiles. In 2008, the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Department exhumed the Santa Fe hitchhiker's remains, extracted DNA, and entered it into national databases. The profile was also submitted to genealogy websites that help identify unknown persons through familial DNA matching. As of my last knowledge, that investigation was ongoing, but had not produced a definitive identification. Building family trees from DNA, tracing relatives, following genealogical lines. It's painstaking work that can take years, and there's no guarantee of success. I'm 74 years old now, retired, and living in Santa Fe still. I've had a good career, helped solve many cases, brought closure to numerous families, but the Santa Fe hitchhiker remains unidentified, her killer uncaught, her story incomplete. Over the decades, I've developed theories about who she might have been. The turquoise jewelry suggested she had some connection to Native American culture. Possibly she was Native herself, or she'd spent time in Native communities, or she'd acquired the jewelry through travel or relationships. The fact that she was hitchhiking suggested she was transient, possibly running from something or towards something. The lack of defensive wounds suggested she might have known her killer, or at least hadn't perceived him as an immediate threat until it was too late. If the man in the tan pickup was the killer, perhaps she'd accepted his ride voluntarily, traveled with him for some distance, and only realized the danger when they were in an isolated location where she couldn't escape or get help. The hamburger and French fries she'd eaten suggested she'd stopped at a restaurant or fast food place hours before her death. Investigators checked restaurants along Highway 285 and I-25, but in 1980, many didn't keep detailed records, and staff couldn't remember every customer from days earlier. My best theory is that the young woman was a runaway or transient traveler, possibly from the Four Corners area based on her jewelry, who'd been hitchhiking west when she encountered someone who offered her a ride. That person, for reasons we'll never fully understand, killed her and dumped her body in the desert. The killer was probably a predator who targeted vulnerable young women, hitchhikers, runaways, people who wouldn't be immediately missed. He might have killed before and killed again after. Serial killers were active in the Southwest during the 1970s and 1980s, and many of their victims were never identified. The lack of sexual assault in this case is unusual for that pattern, but not unheard of. Some killers derive satisfaction from the act of killing itself, from the power and control, rather than from sexual violence. Or perhaps he was interrupted before he could assault her, or perhaps he had other motivations we can't understand from the outside. The Santa Fe hitchhiker has been featured in several true crime books and television programs over the years. The NamUs database, National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, includes her case with photographs, physical description, and details about the jewelry and clothing. Investigators continue to check periodically for matches or new information. What troubles me most is the anonymity. This young woman lived for probably 18 to 22 years, had experiences and relationships, had thoughts and feelings and dreams. She traveled through New Mexico in March 1980, wore beautiful turquoise jewelry, smoked Marlboro cigarettes, read paperback books. She was a real person, and yet we don't know her name. We don't know where she came from, where she was going, who loved her, who might have missed her. We don't know if somewhere, a mother or father or sibling still wonders what happened to her, or if she'd been so disconnected from family that her absence was never noticed. That's the tragedy of unidentified victims. They're reduced to physical descriptions and case numbers, to forensic details and evidence lists. The person they were, their personality, their history, their humanity is lost. I visited her grave occasionally over the years. It's in a quiet section of the cemetery, well maintained, with flowers sometimes left by people who've heard her story and been moved by it. There's something poignant about strangers caring for the grave of someone whose name they don't know. I hope someday the genetic genealogy investigation will identify her. I hope we'll learn her name, notify whatever family she had, perhaps exhume and return her remains to them for burial in a family plot where she belongs. I hope we'll finally know who she was, and I hope we'll identify the person who killed her. Even if that person is dead now, and given that 44 years have passed, they might well be. I'd like to know who they were, to close that chapter of the case, to give the Santa Fe hitchhiker whatever justice is still possible after all this time. But even if neither of those things happens, even if she remains forever unidentified and her killer forever unknown, she won't be forgotten. Her case file remains open. Her DNA is in databases. People still care about solving her case, and people like me will keep telling her story, keep insisting that she mattered, keep refusing to let her become just another statistic. She was a person. She deserves to be known, to be named, to be remembered as more than just the Santa Fe hitchhiker. And until that day comes, if it ever does, I'll keep her memory alive, keep advocating for her case, keep hoping that somehow, someday, she'll get her name back and the justice she deserves. That's all I can do now. Remember her, honor her, and refuse to let her be completely forgotten. It's not enough. She deserves so much more, but it's what I have to give. And for a young woman who died alone in the New Mexico desert 44 years ago, maybe being remembered is at least something. She mattered, she was real, and she won't be forgotten. Not as long as there are people who care about giving names back to the nameless and justice to the forgotten. That's my promise to her, and I'll keep it for whatever time I have left. My name is Gerald Thompson, and I was a deputy with the Dallas County Sheriff's Department in Iowa for 31 years. I worked the Van Meter area for most of my career, and I was the first law enforcement officer on scene when Charles and Irene Phelps were found murdered in their cabin on November 8, 1977. That case haunted our small department for years and remains officially unsolved to this day. Van Meter in 1977 was a tiny town of maybe 600 people, about 20 miles west of Des Moines, along the Raccoon River. It was quiet, rural, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, and crime was mostly limited to the occasional drunk driving arrest or teenage vandalism. The Phelpses had lived in their riverside cabin for about 8 years after Charles retired from his job as a machinist in Des Moines. Charles was 68 in 1977. Irene was 65. They were a friendly couple, well-liked in the community. Charles liked to fish. Irene kept a small garden, and they hosted a regular poker game at their cabin every other Friday night. The poker games had been going on for years, nothing serious, mostly friends and acquaintances from Van Meter and surrounding areas playing for small stakes, socializing, having a few beers. What some people knew, but wasn't widely advertised, was that Charles didn't trust banks. He'd lived through the Depression as a child, and he kept cash on hand, substantial amounts according to his nephew who managed his affairs. Estimates ranged from $5,000 to $10,000 hidden in the cabin at any given time. It wasn't a secret to people who knew the Phelpses well, but it wasn't common knowledge either. On the morning of November 8, 1977, I received a call from Brenda Morrison, a neighbor who lived about a quarter-mile down the river road from the Phelpses. She was worried because the Phelpses' dog, a beagle named Rusty, had been barking continuously since the previous evening. That wasn't normal. Rusty was usually quiet, and the Phelpses were good about bringing him inside or quieting him down. Brenda had walked over that morning to check on them, knocked on the door, received no answer. She'd looked through a window and seen what looked like someone lying on the floor. I drove out immediately, arriving at the cabin around 9:30 a.m. It was a small single-story structure, maybe 800 square feet, sitting about 50 yards back from the river. The property was wooded, private, set back from the road. The cabin looked normal from the outside. No signs of disturbance, no broken windows, no indication anything was wrong. I knocked and called out, identifying myself. No response. I tried the door. It was unlocked. I opened it and stepped inside. The cabin had a small living room that opened directly into a kitchen area. Charles Phelps was lying face down on the living room floor near the couch, a pool of dried blood around his head. I checked for a pulse. He was cold, clearly dead, had been for hours. From the entry wound visible at the base of his skull, it appeared he'd been shot execution style. I drew my weapon and carefully checked the rest of the cabin. In the bedroom, I found Irene. She was lying on the bed, on her back, shot once in the forehead, also clearly dead for hours. And locked in the bedroom with her was Rusty, the beagle, unharmed and barking frantically. I secured the scene and radioed for backup. The Dallas County Sheriff himself, Walt Henderson, arrived within 30 minutes, along with the county coroner and 2 other deputies. We processed the scene methodically, but what we found was baffling. There was no sign of forced entry. The front door had been unlocked when I arrived, but the back door was locked from the inside. All the windows were secure. Whoever killed the Phelpses had either been let in voluntarily or had a key or had found the door unlocked. Nothing appeared to be stolen. Charles's wallet was on the kitchen counter with $63 in cash. Irene's purse was in the bedroom with $40 and her jewelry, including a diamond ring worth several $100s, still inside. The television, the radio, other valuable items were all present and undisturbed. Most significantly, after we searched the cabin thoroughly, we found Charles's cash stash. It was in a lockbox hidden in a floor panel under the bed in the spare room, exactly where his nephew later told us Charles always kept it. The lockbox contained $7,300 in bills of various denominations. It hadn't been touched. The medical examiner determined both Charles and Irene had been dead for approximately 12 to 18 hours, putting the time of death sometime between 5 p.m. and 11 p.m. on November 7th. Both had been killed with a small caliber handgun, probably a .22 or .25. The bullets had fragmented, making ballistic analysis difficult, but they appeared to be from the same weapon. The sequence appeared to be that Charles had been shot first in the living room. Irene had then been shot in the bedroom. The dog, Rusty, had been put in the bedroom with Irene, possibly by the killer, possibly by Irene herself before she was killed. The bedroom door had been closed, trapping the dog inside, which is why he'd been barking continuously. The execution-style killings suggested this was deliberate, calculated, but the lack of theft, especially the untouched cash, made it inexplicable. If robbery was the motive, why leave $7,300? If it wasn't robbery, what was the motive? We interviewed everyone who knew the Phelpses, friends, neighbors, family members, the regular poker game participants. Charles and Irene had no known enemies, no disputes with anyone, no debts or financial problems. They were simple, quiet people living a comfortable retirement. Nobody could think of any reason someone would want to kill them. Then we learned about the Bible salesman. According to several neighbors, a man had been going door to door in the Van Meter area during the first week of November, selling Bibles and religious books. He'd driven a white or cream-colored sedan, possibly a Ford or Chevrolet, with out-of-state plates, Ohio, Indiana, something from the Midwest but not Iowa. He was described as white, 30s or 40s, medium build, clean cut, wearing a suit, and carrying a leather briefcase full of books and pamphlets. Brenda Morrison, the neighbor who'd found the bodies, remembered him stopping at her house on November 4th. He'd been polite, professional, had given her a business card for a religious publishing company. She'd declined to buy anything, but he'd been friendly and hadn't been pushy. She remembered he'd mentioned he was staying at a motel in West Des Moines and would be working the area for another week or so. Another neighbor, Frank Colby, who lived about a mile from the Phelpses, had also spoken with the salesman. Frank recalled that the man had asked specific questions about the area, who lived in which houses, whether people were home during the day, that sort of thing. Frank had thought it was just sales strategy, getting to know the territory, but in retrospect, it felt like reconnaissance. Most significantly, a man matching the salesman's description had been seen at the Phelps cabin on the afternoon of November 7th, just hours before the estimated time of death. A mail carrier, Ruth Daniels, had been delivering mail along the river road around 2 p.m. that day and had noticed a cream-colored sedan parked in the Phelpses' driveway. She'd seen a man in a suit carrying a briefcase walking up to the cabin door. She hadn't thought anything of it. People visited the Phelpses regularly. We tried to track down the Bible salesman. We checked motels in West Des Moines and surrounding areas. None had registered guests matching the description or connected to religious publishing companies. We contacted religious publishing houses in Ohio and Indiana. None employed traveling salesmen in Iowa during that period, and none recognized the business card Brenda Morrison had kept, which turned out to be fake. The company name printed on it didn't exist. We checked with law enforcement in surrounding counties, asking if anyone had seen a suspicious door-to-door salesman. A few leads came in. People remembered someone fitting the description in various towns, but the reports were vague and couldn't be verified. Whoever this man was, he'd disappeared as quickly as he'd appeared. The working theory became that the Bible salesman was a con man or criminal who'd been casing houses in rural Iowa, looking for easy targets. He'd heard somehow that the Phelpses kept cash, had visited them on November 7th under the pretense of selling Bibles, had gained entry to the cabin, and then had killed them. But that theory had problems. If he knew about the cash and came to steal it, why didn't he take it? If he'd killed them and then been interrupted or panicked before he could search for the money, why was the scene so calm and organized? The execution-style killings suggested calculation, not panic. And there was the dog. Rusty was a friendly beagle, but he would have barked at a stranger entering the cabin. Yet neighbors reported hearing no commotion until later that evening, which was when Rusty had started barking continuously, presumably after the murders. Had Rusty known the killer? Had the killer somehow quieted the dog? Why lock the dog in the bedroom rather than silence him permanently? The investigation continued for months. The case was featured in Iowa newspapers, on local television broadcasts, and crime bulletins sent to law enforcement across the Midwest. The FBI's involvement was requested and granted. 2 murders of elderly people in a small Iowa town warranted federal attention. We developed a profile of the killer. Likely male, comfortable with firearms, capable of cold-blooded execution, organized and methodical. The fake business card and the door-to-door sales story suggested someone who'd planned this, who'd been operating with a deliberate strategy. He'd probably had a criminal history, possibly had killed before, but without fingerprints, without the murder weapon, without witnesses who could provide detailed descriptions, we had nowhere to go. The cream-colored sedan was too generic. Thousands of similar vehicles in the Midwest. The physical description of the Bible salesman was vague enough to fit thousands of men. We investigated the poker game angle, wondering if someone connected to those games had targeted the Phelpses. The regular players were all interviewed extensively, their alibis checked, their backgrounds investigated. Most were friends Charles and Irene had known for years, local businessmen, retirees, working-class folks. None had criminal records, none had financial problems that would motivate murder, and all had solid alibis for November 7th. We also looked into Charles's past, wondering if something from his working years had caught up with him. Had he witnessed something, known something, made enemies he'd never mentioned? His employment history was unremarkable. 30 years as a machinist at the same Des Moines manufacturing plant. Good worker, no conflicts. There was nothing there. The case went cold by mid-1978. We'd exhausted leads, interviewed everyone connected to the Phelpses, checked and rechecked every angle. The murders remained unsolved. The Bible salesman remained unidentified, and the motive remained a mystery. I worked the case on and off for the rest of my career, checking periodically for new information, following up on occasional tips. In the 1980s and 90s, whenever there was a murder with similar characteristics, execution-style shootings, elderly victims in rural areas, I'd check if there might be a connection. Nothing ever matched definitively. The cabin was eventually sold by the Phelps family and torn down in the mid-1980s. The property was subdivided and developed into residential lots. New houses sit where Charles and Irene were killed, occupied by people who probably don't know what happened there 47 years ago. I retired from the Dallas County Sheriff's Department in 2008. I'm 84 years old now, living in Adel, about 10 miles from Van Meter. I've had time to think about the case, to develop theories about what really happened that November day in 1977. My theory, the one I keep coming back to, is that the Bible salesman was indeed the killer, but his motive wasn't robbery, at least not primarily. I think he was a sociopath who developed a method for finding vulnerable victims in rural areas. The door-to-door sales routine gave him access to homes, allowed him to assess targets, gave him a cover story that didn't arouse suspicion. He'd learned about the Phelpses, possibly heard about Charles's cash from someone, possibly just identified them as isolated and vulnerable. He'd visited on November 7th, gained entry by claiming to be selling Bibles, and at some point had revealed his true intentions. Maybe he'd tried to rob them, and Charles resisted. Maybe there'd been a confrontation that escalated. Or maybe, and this is darker, he'd killed for the thrill of it, and robbery was never the actual motive. Some killers derive satisfaction from exerting power over others, from taking lives. The execution-style killings suggest someone comfortable with murder, someone for whom this might not have been the first time. The fact that he didn't take the cash might mean he panicked after the killings, or it might mean the cash was never his real objective. If he was a serial killer rather than a robber, the money wouldn't have mattered to him. The dog being locked in the bedroom might indicate some twisted sense of mercy. He was willing to kill people, but not an innocent animal. Or it might have been pragmatic. Rusty knew the killer hadn't barked when he'd entered, and the killer simply contained him in the bedroom to prevent him from becoming a nuisance during or after the murders. That's my theory, but I can't prove any of it. The Bible salesman, if he existed and if he was the killer, disappeared completely. He might have moved on to other states, killed other victims, died years ago, or been arrested for unrelated crimes and imprisoned without anyone connecting him to the Phelps murders. The case remains officially open with the Dallas County Sheriff's Department. Periodically, when there's a slow news period or an anniversary comes up, local media will run stories about the unsolved murder of the Phelpses. Tips still come in occasionally, though less frequently now. Each one is investigated, though none have led to a resolution. Charles's nephew, who inherited the estate, died in 2015. Most of the people who knew Charles and Irene well are gone now. The generation that remembered them, that attended their funeral, that wondered what had happened, they've mostly passed away themselves. I'm one of the last people alive who worked the case firsthand, who saw that cabin, who looked at Charles and Irene and promised myself I'd find out who did this to them. I haven't kept that promise. The case remains unsolved, and I'm running out of time to see it resolved. But I haven't forgotten them. I keep copies of the case files in my home office. I look at them sometimes, reviewing the evidence, wondering if there's something we missed, some connection we didn't see. After 47 years, I'm not likely to spot something new, but I can't help trying. What I know for certain is that Charles and Irene Phelps deserved better. They were good people, harmed no one, were living peacefully in their retirement. Someone came to their home, murdered them in cold blood, and walked away. That person has lived 47 years with that secret, has perhaps killed others, has never faced consequences for what they did. That injustice bothers me. It's bothered me for nearly half a century. But I'm realistic enough to know that some cases don't get solved, some killers don't get caught, and sometimes the bad guys win. The best I can do now is remember Charles and Irene, tell their story, make sure they're not forgotten. They mattered. Their deaths mattered. And even though we never caught their killer, they deserve to be remembered as real people, not just as victims in an unsolved case. Someday, maybe, someone will come forward with information, a deathbed confession, a relative finding suspicious items, a cold case investigator making a connection we missed. DNA technology keeps improving, and if we can extract usable DNA from evidence at the scene, maybe it'll eventually match someone in a database. I won't live to see it. I've accepted that, but the case file will remain. The evidence will be preserved, and maybe someday, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now, someone will finally solve the Van Meter cabin murders. Until then, Charles and Irene rest in the Van Meter cemetery, side by side, their headstones simple and understated. I visit sometimes, especially on the anniversary of their deaths, and I tell them I'm sorry we didn't catch the person who killed them. I tell them they're not forgotten, that people still care, that their case is still active. It's not enough. It's not justice, but it's all I have to give. And for two people who were murdered in their own home 47 years ago, maybe being remembered is at least something. Charles and Irene Phelps were real people who lived real lives. They deserve to be remembered for who they were, not just for how they died. And as long as people like me are around to tell their story, they won't be completely forgotten. That's my final promise to them: memory, acknowledgement, and the refusal to let their deaths become just another cold case statistic. It's not justice, but it's something, and sometimes something is all we have left to give. My name is Michael Sterling, and I was a park ranger with the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Service for 36 years. I worked the Echo Lake area for most of my career, and I was one of the first responders when David Romer was reported missing in September 1976. That case has stayed with me for 48 years, a reminder that the mountains, beautiful as they are, can be unforgiving and inexplicable. Echo Lake sits at about 10,600 feet elevation in the Mount Evans Wilderness, accessible by a winding mountain road that's only open from late May to early October. It's a popular area for camping, fishing, and hiking, though it's remote enough that you need to be prepared and self-sufficient. Cell phones didn't exist in 1976, and the nearest payphone was 15 miles down the mountain in Idaho Springs. David Romer was a wildlife photographer from Denver, 31 years old, unmarried, made his living selling photographs to magazines and nature publications. He was experienced in the backcountry, had been camping and photographing Colorado's wilderness for over a decade. He knew what he was doing, wasn't the type to take foolish risks or wander off unprepared. He'd driven up to Echo Lake on Tuesday, September 7th, 1976, planning to spend 4 or 5 days camping and photographing the area. He'd told his brother Stephen about his plans, mentioned he wanted to capture the early autumn colors and maybe get some shots of elk during their rutting season. He was expected back in Denver by Sunday, September 12th. When David didn't return and didn't call by Monday evening, Stephen became concerned. He tried David's apartment repeatedly. No answer. On Tuesday morning, September 14th, he drove up to Echo Lake to check on his brother. Stephen found David's Jeep Cherokee in the parking area near the trailhead, locked and undisturbed. He hiked the 1.5 miles to the designated camping area where David had said he'd be setting up. That's where he found the tent. It was a small backpacking tent, properly erected and secured, fully zipped shut from the inside. David's sleeping bag was laid out but not slept in. His backpack was there, food supplies neatly organized, water bottles full. His camera equipment, expensive Nikon cameras and lenses, was carefully stored in protective cases. Nothing appeared to be missing or disturbed. The tripod was set up about 20 feet from the tent, positioned toward the lake, as if David had been preparing for a sunrise or sunset shot. His favorite camera was still mounted on it, lens cap on. Stephen called out for David, searched the immediate area, then hiked back down to his car and drove until he found a phone to call us. I was on duty that Tuesday and took the call. I hiked up with 2 other rangers, reaching the campsite around 3 p.m. What Stephen had described was accurate. The site looked like someone had simply stepped away for a moment and would return any second. There were no signs of struggle, no disturbed earth, no blood, no indication that anything violent had occurred. David's wallet was in the tent with about $60 in cash and his driver's license. His car keys were in his backpack. I checked the surrounding area carefully. The ground was relatively soft near the lake. You'd expect to see tracks if someone had walked around. There were David's boot prints around the tent and near the tripod, clearly identifiable by the distinctive lug pattern. But those prints didn't lead anywhere conclusive. They circled the campsite, moved between the tent and the lake, but didn't appear to head off into the forest or up any of the nearby trails. We found one set of his prints heading north toward the tree line, maybe 30 yards from the tent, but then they just stopped. The ground became rockier in that direction, harder surface where prints wouldn't register clearly, so it was possible he'd continue that way, but it was strange not to see any definitive trail. The real mystery emerged when we processed David's camera. Stephen mentioned that David always shot multiple rolls of film during his trips, and we found 3 exposed rolls in his camera bag, plus the one still in the camera on the tripod. We sent them to be developed immediately. The first 3 rolls were exactly what you'd expect from a nature photographer. Landscape shots of Echo Lake at various times of day, close-ups of wildflowers, a few distant shots of what might have been deer or elk through the trees. The quality was professional, the compositions carefully considered. David knew his craft, but the last frame on the 4th roll, the one still in the camera, was different. It was out of focus, dark, taken at what appeared to be dusk or nighttime. You could make out what looked like headlights, 2 bright spots penetrating through dark shapes that might have been trees. The rest of the image was indistinct, blurry, as if the camera had been moving or hastily aimed when the shot was taken. That photograph changed the nature of the investigation. The headlights suggested a vehicle, but vehicles weren't permitted beyond the parking area. The road ended there, and the trail to the campsite was hiking only, too narrow and rough for any car or truck. How could there be headlights in the forest near David's tent? We organized a full search operation. Over the next week, we had search and rescue teams, tracking dogs, volunteers from the local community, over 100 people combing the Mount Evans wilderness looking for David or any sign of what had happened to him. The dogs tracked David's scent from the campsite north toward the tree line, following the direction where his footprints had seemed to lead. But after about a quarter mile, the dogs lost the scent. They'd circle, trying to pick it up again, but it was gone. It was as if David had simply vanished at that spot. We searched ravines, checked areas where someone could have fallen, investigated the lake in case he'd drowned. Divers went down. Echo Lake is cold and deep, visibility poor, but found nothing. We checked caves, crevices, anywhere a body might be concealed or trapped. We also tried to explain the headlights in the photograph. Could it have been a reflection? Could David have been photographing the sunset and captured some optical phenomenon? Could it have been lights from aircraft passing overhead? The photo experts we consulted said the lights appeared to be ground level, roughly horizontal to the camera's position. They had the characteristics of vehicle headlights, paired sources, bright white light, positioned at a height consistent with a car or truck. But that made no sense. There was no way to drive a vehicle to that location, unless someone had driven off-road through the forest using some route we weren't aware of. We checked old logging roads, maintenance access trails, any possible way a vehicle could have approached David's campsite. We found nothing practical. The terrain was too rough, the trees too dense. You couldn't drive there without leaving obvious signs of damage to vegetation and ground, and we found no such evidence. The investigation expanded. We looked into David's personal life, wondering if there was any reason someone might want to harm him. His brother Stephen was cooperative and transparent. David had no enemies, no debts, no romantic entanglements that had ended badly. He was a quiet, solitary man who loved nature photography and spent most of his time alone in the wilderness. There was no apparent motive for anyone to harm him. We considered the possibility that David had staged his disappearance, but that didn't hold up. His camera equipment alone was worth thousands of dollars. He wouldn't have left it behind. His wallet with cash and identification was in the tent. His vehicle was there. If he'd wanted to vanish, he would have driven away, not left everything behind. By October, as the weather turned colder and snow began falling at Echo Lake's elevation, the active search was suspended. The area became inaccessible for the winter months. In spring 1977, we conducted additional searches, hoping the snowmelt might reveal something. Nothing was found. The case gradually went cold. David's family, his brother Stephen, and their elderly parents struggled with the lack of closure. They held a memorial service in 1977, though David's legal status remained missing rather than deceased. His photography was exhibited at a Denver gallery, a tribute to his talent and passion. But there were no answers about what had happened to him. Then in July 1982, 6 years after David's disappearance, a hiker named Patricia Chen was exploring an area about 4 miles northeast of Echo Lake, well off the established trails, when she found something unusual. Wedged tightly into a split in a fallen log was a pocket knife. It was weathered but identifiable as a Swiss Army knife, and when Patricia cleaned it up, she could see initials carved into the handle. DR. She reported the find to park rangers, and the knife was turned over to the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Department, which had maintained the official investigation into David's disappearance. Stephen Romer confirmed it was David's knife. He'd given it to his brother years earlier and recognized the initials he'd carved himself. The discovery location was significant, 4 miles northeast of the campsite, through difficult terrain, across a steep ravine and over a ridge, not a route someone would take casually, especially at night. If David had gone that direction, why? What would have drawn him so far from his camp? We organized new searches around the area where the knife had been found. We brought in cadaver dogs, checked the surrounding terrain thoroughly, but we found nothing else. No clothing, no equipment, no human remains, just the knife wedged in a log, as if David had placed it there deliberately or it had fallen from his pocket. Over the years, I've developed theories about what happened to David Romer. The photograph of the headlights is the key piece of evidence, the detail that doesn't fit any simple explanation. My best theory, the one that makes the most sense given all the evidence, is that David encountered other people at his campsite that night, people who shouldn't have been there, who were doing something illegal, poaching, drug trafficking, something that required secrecy and access to remote areas. Perhaps they had found an off-road route we didn't know about, or they were using ATVs or dirt bikes that could navigate terrain vehicles couldn't. They approached David's camp, possibly didn't realize anyone was there until they were close. David, hearing the vehicles or seeing the lights, grabbed his camera and took that last photograph, maybe as evidence, maybe just instinctively documenting what he saw. The people realized they'd been spotted, possibly photographed. They confronted David, realized he was a threat to whatever operation they were running. They forced him to leave with them, maybe at gunpoint, taking him away from the campsite. That would explain why there was no struggle at the tent, no signs of violence. David went with them because he had no choice. They took him northeast, deep into the wilderness. Maybe they intended to kill him and hide his body, or maybe they just wanted to scare him, to get him far enough away that he wouldn't report what he'd seen. At some point during that forced march through the mountains, David's knife either fell from his pocket or he managed to leave it deliberately as a marker, hoping searchers might find it. What happened after that, I can't say with certainty. Maybe David was killed and his body concealed in a location we never searched, a cave, a mine shaft, buried in a remote location. Or maybe he tried to escape, fled further into the wilderness, got lost or injured, and died of exposure. The mountains are unforgiving. If David was several miles from his camp, disoriented, possibly injured, without supplies, he wouldn't have survived long, especially once the cold September nights set in. That theory has problems. We never found evidence of vehicles or ATVs in the area. The knife's location doesn't clearly support the route I've described. It could have been dropped at any time, for any reason. And we never found David's remains, which you'd think would turn up eventually if he died of exposure in the wilderness. The alternative theories seem even less plausible. The idea that David staged his disappearance doesn't account for the abandoned equipment and vehicle. The idea that he had an accident close to camp doesn't explain the knife found 4 miles away. The idea that he was attacked by an animal doesn't fit the lack of blood or signs of struggle. There have been suggestions over the years that David's disappearance was connected to other cases: missing hikers in Colorado during the 1970s, unsolved murders in the region. Investigators have looked for patterns, for links between cases. Nothing definitive has emerged. David's case remains unique, unexplained by any larger pattern of criminal activity. I retired from Colorado parks and wildlife in 2012, but I still live in Idaho Springs, still hike in the Mount Evans wilderness occasionally. I'm 76 years old now, not as spry as I was in 1976, but I know those mountains intimately after decades of working there. I've been to David's campsite many times over the years. The exact spot isn't marked, but I know where it was, can navigate there without difficulty. I go there sometimes, especially in September around the anniversary of his disappearance, and I think about that night. I think about David setting up his tripod for a photograph, about the headlights appearing through the trees, about the decision he made in that moment to document what he was seeing. I wonder if he knew he was in danger. I wonder if he tried to run, tried to hide, tried to talk his way out of whatever situation he'd stumbled into. I wonder where his remains are, whether they're still out there in the wilderness waiting to be found, or whether they've been reclaimed by the mountain ecosystem, scattered by animals, decomposed beyond recognition. Stephen Romer, David's brother, is still alive, living in Colorado Springs. He's in his 80s now, has spent nearly half a century not knowing what happened to his brother. We've talked occasionally over the years. He's made peace with the uncertainty as much as anyone can. He believes David is dead, has been since 1976, and he's grateful for the years they had together, rather than dwelling on the mystery of how it ended. David's parents both passed away in the 1990s without ever knowing what happened to their son. That's the cruelest aspect of missing persons cases, the families who live with uncertainty, who can't fully grieve because there's no definitive end, who spend years hoping for answers that never come. The case remains officially open with the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Department. David's information is in missing persons databases. His dental records and physical description are on file in case remains are ever found and need identification. But realistically, after 48 years, the chances of solving the case are minimal. If David's remains are ever found, they'll likely be discovered by accident, a hiker stumbling across bones, a construction project uncovering a burial site, erosion revealing something that's been hidden for decades. That happens sometimes with old cases. Time and nature eventually give up their secrets. Until then, David Romer remains one of the mountain's mysteries, the photographer who went into the wilderness to capture its beauty and never came back, the man whose last photograph showed something he shouldn't have seen, something that may have cost him his life. I keep that photograph in my files at home, a copy, not the original. I've looked at it hundreds of times, trying to understand what David saw that night, what those lights really were, what happened in the moments after he pressed the shutter release. The photograph doesn't provide answers. It only raises questions, the same questions that have haunted this case for nearly 5 decades. Who was out there? Why were they there? What did they do to David? Where is he now? I may never know the answers, but I'll remember David. Remember the work we did trying to find him. Remember the family that's carried this loss for so long. That's all I can offer now. Memory, and the acknowledgement that David Romer mattered, that his disappearance wasn't just another unsolved case, but a real tragedy affecting real people. The mountains are beautiful, but they're also vast and indifferent. They don't give up their secrets easily. David learned that the hard way, and his family has lived with the consequences ever since. I hope someday his remains are found, that his family finally gets the closure they deserve, that the mystery of what happened that September night in 1976 is finally solved. But even if that never happens, David won't be forgotten. His photographs survive, his memory endures, and people like me will keep telling his story as long as we're able. That's the best I can do for him. Remember, honor, and refuse to let him become just another name in a cold case file. David Romer was a talented photographer, a dedicated outdoorsman, and a person who deserved better than what happened to him at Echo Lake. The mountains keep their secrets, but those of us who knew David, who searched for him, who've carried his story for decades, we keep his memory, and that matters even if it can't bring him home. My name is Richard Caldwell, and I owned the Bayview Marina in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, from 1979 to to 1986. It was a small operation on the Chesapeake Bay, maybe 40 boat slips, a fuel dock, a small repair shop, and a convenience store that sold bait, beer, and basic marine supplies. We catered mostly to recreational boaters and local fishing charters. It was a decent living, nothing glamorous, but I liked the work and the community. Frankie Hollins started working for me as a boat mechanic in the spring of 1983. He was 25 then, a local kid who'd grown up around boats, knew engines inside and out, could fix just about anything. He was good with customers, showed up on time, didn't cause problems. He was quiet, kept to himself mostly, but friendly enough when people talked to him. Frankie lived alone in a small apartment in Glen Burnie, about 15 minutes from the marina. He'd never married, didn't have kids, though he had a girlfriend named Tracy, who worked at a restaurant in Annapolis. His parents lived in the area too. His father worked construction. His mother was a school cafeteria worker. They were good people, working class folks who'd raised Frankie to be responsible and hardworking. By the fall of 1984, Frankie had been with me for about a year and a half. He'd become my go-to mechanic, the guy I trusted to handle the more complicated repairs. He had a natural talent for diagnosing problems, could listen to an engine and tell you what was wrong. Boat owners specifically requested him for work on their vessels. The night of November 15, 1984 was a Thursday. It was getting late in the season. Most recreational boaters had already pulled their boats out for winter storage, and the marina was quieter than during summer months. Frankie had been working late finishing up some winterization jobs. I'd left around 6 p.m., and Frankie said he'd lock up when he was done, probably around 8 o'clock or 9 p.m. That was standard procedure. I trusted Frankie with keys to the shop and the gate. He'd closed up by himself dozens of times before, without any problems. The next morning, Friday, November 16th, I arrived at the marina around 7:30 a.m. Frankie's truck, an old Ford F-1 150, primer gray, beat up but reliable, was still in the parking lot. That was unusual. Frankie was supposed to be there at 8 a.m., but he usually didn't arrive that early and definitely didn't leave his truck overnight. I walked down to the dock. The gate was closed but not locked. It was hanging open slightly, not secured the way Frankie usually left it. I immediately felt uneasy. I found Frankie's work area on the main dock, near where we kept the fuel pumps. His toolbox was open, tools spread out on the dock table as if he'd been in the middle of a job. His paycheck, I had given it to him the day before, Thursday being payday, was sitting on the table still in its envelope, uncashed. His thermos of coffee was there, still half full but cold. His jacket was draped over a piling. But no Frankie. I called out for him, walked around the marina checking the boats, the shop, the bathrooms. Nothing. His truck was locked, and when I looked through the window, I could see his keys still in the ignition. That made no sense. Why would he leave his keys in a locked truck? I called the Anne Arundel County Police around 8:15 a.m. 2 officers arrived within 30 minutes. They searched the marina more thoroughly than I had, checked every boat slip, looked in storage areas, walked the entire property. One officer noticed something I'd missed, a set of wet footprints leading from Frankie's work area to the edge of the pier. The footprints were distinct, boot treads, looked like they matched the work boots Frankie always wore. They led from his workstation along the dock toward the end of the pier about 50 feet, and then they just stopped right at the edge. No prints turning around, no signs of someone climbing into a boat, just prints ending where the dock met the water. The officer called for more backup and for the Marine unit. By afternoon, we had divers in the water searching around the pier and the immediate marina area. The Chesapeake Bay in November is cold and murky, visibility terrible, but the divers did their best. They searched for hours, checking the pilings, the bottom around the docks, anywhere a body might have sunk or become entangled. They found nothing. No body, no evidence of Frankie in the water, nothing that explained what had happened. The police treated it as a missing person case. They interviewed me extensively. When had I last seen Frankie? Had he seemed upset or worried about anything? Did he have enemies? Were there any conflicts with customers or co-workers? I told them everything I knew, which wasn't much. Frankie had seemed normal on Thursday, in good spirits, talking about plans to take Tracy out for dinner over the weekend. Nothing suggested he was troubled or in danger. They interviewed Tracy, his girlfriend. She said Frankie had called her Thursday evening around 7:30 p.m., said he was finishing up at the marina and would call her when he got home. She'd waited until about 10:30 p.m., then went to bed, figuring he'd gotten busy and would call the next day. She'd had no idea anything was wrong until the police contacted her Friday afternoon. They interviewed Frankie's parents, his few close friends, people who'd done business with him at the marina. Everyone said the same thing. Frankie was reliable, responsible, not the type to just disappear. He had no history of mental health problems, no suicidal ideation, no reason anyone could think of to walk away from his life. The police examined Frankie's truck thoroughly. The keys in the ignition suggested he'd intended to come back. You don't lock your truck with the keys inside unless you're planning to return quickly. Inside the truck, they found his wallet with his driver's license and about $40 cash. In the glove compartment was the truck's registration and proof of insurance. Nothing seemed missing or disturbed. The investigation expanded to consider foul play. Had Frankie been meeting someone at the marina that night? Had there been a confrontation? Had he been forced or lured to the end of the pier? That's when the rumors started. A couple of the part-time dock hands mentioned to police that they'd wondered if Frankie might have been involved in something shady. Nothing concrete, just suspicions. Boats would occasionally disappear from the marina, get taken out for unauthorized joyrides, then show up back in their slips a day or two later. It had happened 3 or 4 times over the past year. The owners would notice their fuel was lower or something was moved, but nothing was actually stolen, so most didn't bother reporting it. One of the dock hands, a kid named Tommy Chin, suggested maybe Frankie had been taking boats out at night, using them for some purpose, and had gotten into trouble somehow. Maybe he'd been stealing boats, selling them, doing something criminal. Maybe he'd pissed off the wrong people and they'd done something to him. I didn't believe it. Frankie had keys and access to boats legitimately for his work. If he wanted to take a boat out, he could have just asked me, and the idea that he was involved in anything serious enough to get himself killed seemed far-fetched. But the police investigated it anyway. They looked into Frankie's finances, checking for unexplained income or large deposits. His bank account showed regular paychecks from me and nothing unusual. They checked to see if he had a criminal record. He didn't, not even a traffic ticket. They asked around the marinas in the area, wondering if Frankie had been connected to any boat theft rings. Nobody had heard anything. The unauthorized boat use at the marina could have been kids joyriding, or it could have been something else entirely, but there was no evidence connecting it to Frankie. Still, the rumors persisted. Some people became convinced Frankie had been involved in criminal activity, had crossed someone dangerous, and had been killed and dumped in the bay where his body would never be found. Others thought maybe he'd gotten into debt with the wrong people, had been running from something, and had staged his disappearance to escape. Neither theory fit what I knew about Frankie, but once rumors start in a small community, they're hard to stop. The search continued for weeks. The Coast Guard was notified, and they kept watch for any bodies that might wash up along the bay. Police divers returned to search the area multiple times. Dogs were brought in to track Frankie's scent, and they led to the same place, the end of the pier, where the footprints stopped. The prevailing theory became that Frankie had gone into the water, either voluntarily or involuntarily. Maybe he'd fallen. The dock could be slippery at night, especially in November when moisture would condense on the wood. Maybe he'd had a medical emergency, a heart attack or seizure, and had stumbled into the water. Maybe he'd been pushed or forced in by someone. But if he'd gone into the water, where was his body? The Chesapeake Bay is vast, and currents can carry things miles from where they enter the water, but typically, bodies surface within a few days. If Frankie had drowned on November 15th, his body should have been found somewhere along the bay shoreline within a week or two. It never was. As winter turned to spring and then summer 1985, the case remained unsolved. The police kept it active, following up on occasional tips, but there were no significant developments. Frankie's parents were devastated, unable to accept that their son had simply vanished. Tracy, his girlfriend, eventually moved away. She couldn't stay in the area with the constant reminders and questions. The marina continued operating, but it was never quite the same. Some customers stopped coming, uncomfortable with the mystery, worried about safety. Some people avoided the end of the pier where Frankie's footprints had stopped, as if the spot was cursed. My business suffered. By 1986, I was struggling financially, and when I received an offer to sell the marina, I took it. The new owners renovated extensively, changed the name, tried to distance themselves from the Frankie Hollins case. I moved to Delaware and started working in a different field entirely. The case file, as far as I know, ended up in the Anne Arundel County Archives. Officially, it remains an unsolved missing person case, though I doubt anyone actively works it anymore. Frankie's been gone for 40 years. Most of the people involved, investigators, witnesses, people who knew him, are retired, moved away, or deceased. I'm 78 years old now, living in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. I haven't worked with boats in decades, but I still think about Frankie Hollins regularly. I think about those footprints leading to the water's edge, about the truck with keys in the ignition, about the uncashed paycheck sitting on the dock table. Over the years, I've developed my own theory about what happened. I think Frankie saw something or someone at the marina that night that put him in danger. Maybe he witnessed something criminal. Drugs being moved through the marina, stolen property being transferred via boat, something that required secrecy and that made him a liability. Maybe someone approached him while he was working late, someone who seemed friendly at first, who engaged him in conversation or asked for help with a boat. Frankie, being helpful and unsuspecting, went with this person to the end of the pier. Once they were there, isolated, the person revealed their true intentions. Maybe Frankie was forced into a boat at gunpoint and taken out onto the bay. Maybe he was killed elsewhere and his body dumped far from the marina. Maybe he was taken alive, held somewhere, possibly killed later. The footprints leading to the water's edge were real, but they might not indicate he went into the water there. They might just show he walked to that location before being forced into a boat. The truck being left with keys inside might have been staged deliberately to make it look like Frankie had intended to return, but something had prevented it. The uncashed paycheck and jacket left behind reinforced that impression. Someone wanted it to look like Frankie had disappeared unexpectedly, possibly fell into the water, rather than being deliberately taken. That's speculation, of course. I have no proof, and the police never found evidence supporting that theory. But it makes more sense to me than the alternatives, that Frankie committed suicide. He had no reason to, and his personality didn't suggest it. Or that he fell accidentally into the water. He was experienced around docks and boats, not likely to make such a fatal mistake. Or that he staged his own disappearance, leaving behind his truck, his money, his paycheck. His entire life doesn't fit that scenario. The boat theft rumors might have had a grain of truth, but not in the way people thought. Maybe criminal activity was happening at the marina, but Frankie wasn't part of it. He just became aware of it, saw something he shouldn't have seen, and was eliminated as a threat. The Chesapeake Bay is vast and deep. If someone took Frankie out in a boat, killed him, and dumped his body weighted down in deep water miles from shore, it might never be found. Thousands of square miles of bay, countless places to hide evidence. Even with modern technology, the bay keeps its secrets. That's my theory, but I'll never know if I'm right. Frankie's case remains unsolved, his fate unknown, his body never recovered. What I do know is that Frankie Hollins was a good kid who worked hard, treated people fairly, and didn't deserve whatever happened to him that November night. He should have gone home to his girlfriend, should have cashed his paycheck, should have had a long life ahead of him. Instead, he walked to the end of a pier and vanished, leaving behind only questions and a family that never got closure. I've thought about reaching out to the Anne Arundel County Police, asking if they'd be willing to review the case with fresh eyes, maybe apply modern investigative techniques, but I'm not sure it would do any good. Without new evidence, without witnesses willing to come forward, there's not much to investigate. If Frankie's still out there in the bay, he's probably been there for 40 years, beyond recovery. If he was buried somewhere on land, the location is known only to whoever put him there. If there are people who know what happened, they've kept silent for 4 decades and probably will continue to do so. That's the frustrating reality of unsolved cases. Sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, the truth remains hidden. Sometimes the bad guys win. Sometimes families never get answers. But Frankie deserves to be remembered. He was real. He mattered. And what happened to him shouldn't be forgotten just because it's unsolved. His parents, both deceased now, spent the rest of their lives wondering what happened to their son. Tracy moved on with her life, but carried that loss with her. The people who knew Frankie remember a decent, hard-working young man who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. That's all I can offer now. Memory and acknowledgement. It's not justice, not closure, but it's something. And for a 26-year-old boat mechanic who walked to the end of a pier on a November night in 1984 and never came home, maybe being remembered is at least a start. Frankie Hollins mattered. His disappearance matters. And even though I can't solve the mystery of what happened to him, I can make sure he's not completely forgotten. That's my promise to him, and to the young man I knew who deserved so much better than the fate he met at Bayview Marina. The water may have swallowed whatever secrets it holds, but memory endures. And as long as people remember Frankie, ask questions about what happened to him, refuse to let his case fade into complete obscurity, there's still hope that someday, somehow, the truth will surface. Until then, I'll keep his memory alive, keep telling his story, and keep hoping that eventually, justice however delayed, will find its way to Frankie Hollins. My name is James Martinez, and I was a construction foreman for Caltrans, the California Department of Transportation, for 33 years. I worked highway projects all over the state, from the Bay Area down to San Diego, supervising crews, managing logistics, making sure the work got done safely and on schedule. In those 3 decades, I saw a lot of things you wouldn't expect. Abandoned vehicles buried in embankments, old mining equipment, historical artifacts, even forgotten grave sites from the 1800s, but nothing prepared me for what we found on Highway 49 near Mariposa in June 1988. We were working on a road widening project along a remote stretch of Highway 49 in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Highway 49 is a scenic route that runs through California's gold country, connecting various historic mining towns. The section we were working on was about 5 miles north of Mariposa, winding through hilly terrain covered in oak trees and chaparral. It was beautiful country, but sparsely populated, mostly just the highway cutting through wilderness. The project involved widening the shoulders and improving drainage. We had a crew of about 12 men operating excavators, graders, and dump trucks. The work was routine, mostly earth moving, cutting into the hillside to create more road surface. On June 14, 1988, a Tuesday morning around 9:30 a.m., one of my equipment operators, a guy named Eddie Reyes, who'd been with Caltrans for years, was running an excavator, cutting into the embankment about 15 feet off the existing highway shoulder. The bucket scraped into something that wasn't just dirt and rock. Eddie stopped immediately and called me over. I walked to where he was working and looked into the excavated area. What I saw was clearly bone, human bone, not animal. I could see what looked like a skull partially exposed in the dirt, along with other bones scattered by the excavator's bucket. I shut down the work site immediately and called the Mariposa County Sheriff's Department. Within an hour, we had deputies on scene, followed shortly by the county coroner. They cordoned off the area and began a careful excavation, bringing in a forensic anthropologist from Fresno to supervise the recovery. What they found was 2 sets of remains, buried in shallow graves about 5 feet apart, maybe 3 feet below what had been the surface level before highway construction decades earlier. The graves were simple, no caskets, no markers, just bodies buried in the dirt and covered over. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Patricia Chen, determined both sets of remains were relatively young adults, probably in their 20s, based on bone development and dental wear. One was male, one was female. They'd been deceased for at least 10 years, possibly as long as 15 years, making the likely death date somewhere between 1973 and 1978. Both skeletons showed signs of trauma. The male had what appeared to be a skull fracture consistent with blunt force trauma. The female had damage to cervical vertebrae, suggesting possible strangulation or a broken neck. Dr. Chen said both injuries could have been fatal, and the manner of death was almost certainly homicide. The remains were clothed, though the fabric had deteriorated significantly. The male wore denim jeans, Levi's based on the metal rivets that survived, and what had been a cotton shirt, along with leather work boots that had mostly rotted away. The female wore jeans as well, a synthetic blouse that had held up somewhat better than natural fibers, and canvas shoes. The clothing provided some clues. Tags from the male's shirt were traced to a department store chain called FedMart, which had operated in California and other western states until it went bankrupt in 1982. That helped narrow the time frame. The clothing was probably from the mid to late 1970s based on the styles and the store's operating period. But the most distinctive piece of evidence was a class ring found near the female skeleton's left hand. It was a 1977 class ring from Fresno High School, gold-colored metal with a blue stone, fairly standard design. The inside of the ring had initials engraved, KM. That ring became the focus of the investigation. Mariposa County Sheriff's Department, working with the Fresno police, obtained yearbooks and records from Fresno High School for 1977. They compiled a list of every female student with the initials KM who'd graduated that year. There were 6 possibilities: Karen Mitchell, Kathleen Morgan, Kelly Martinez, Kimberly Morrison, Kristen Murphy, and Carla Mills. Investigators tracked down each one. Karen Mitchell was alive and well, living in Sacramento, working as a nurse. Kathleen Morgan was in Oregon, married with 3 kids. Kelly Martinez was in Southern California. Kimberly Morrison was in Texas. Kristen Murphy was in Arizona. All 5 were located and interviewed. All confirmed they still had their class rings or had lost them in inexplainable circumstances. That left Carla Mills. According to school records, Carla had graduated from Fresno High in 1977, but after that, there was no clear trail. She'd never applied for a driver's license renewal after the one issued when she turned 16. She'd never registered to vote. She'd never filed tax returns or had credit in her name. She'd essentially disappeared after graduation. Investigators contacted Carla's family. Her parents had both died in the early 1980s. Her father from a heart attack, her mother from cancer. She'd been an only child. Extended family members, an aunt, some cousins, remembered Carla vaguely. She'd been quiet, artistic, had talked about maybe going to art school or traveling. After graduation, she'd mentioned wanting to leave Fresno, to see California, to figure out what she wanted to do with her life. The family hadn't heard from Carla after the summer of 1977. They'd assumed she'd left town, was traveling, would eventually get in touch. When she didn't, they figured she'd made a new life somewhere and didn't want to stay connected to her past. It happened sometimes, especially in the 1970s when young people were dropping out of conventional society, hitchhiking around, living in communes, or on the road. Nobody had reported Carla missing because nobody thought she was missing. They thought she'd left voluntarily and just never came back. Dental records were obtained from Carla's high school dentist, who'd fortunately kept records dating back to the 1970s. The dental pattern matched the female skeleton found on Highway 49. The coroner officially identified the remains as Carla Mills, age 18 at the time of death. That identification was a breakthrough, but it also raised more questions. Who was the male buried with her? Had they been traveling together? Had they been a couple? How had they ended up murdered and buried alongside Highway 49? The male's remains were more difficult to identify. He had no jewelry, no identification, nothing distinctive that could lead to a name. His dental work was basic, a few fillings, nothing unusual. His fingerprints, of course, were long gone. Investigators checked missing persons reports from the mid to late 1970s throughout California and surrounding states, looking for young men in their 20s who disappeared around the same time as Carla Mills. Several possibilities emerged, but without DNA technology, which was still in its infancy, in 1988, and not routinely used for identification. It was difficult to definitively match the remains to any specific missing person. The investigation tried to reconstruct what might have happened. The theory that made the most sense was that Carla Mills had left Fresno in the summer of 1977, possibly hitchhiking through California's gold country. She'd met or been traveling with a young man, possibly a boyfriend, possibly someone she'd met on the road. They'd encountered someone dangerous, possibly someone who'd offered them a ride, or someone they'd encountered at a campsite or rest area. That person had killed them both. The blunt force trauma to the male's skull suggested a sudden violent attack, and Carla's neck injury suggested she'd been strangled or had her neck broken. The killer had buried them in shallow graves alongside Highway 49, in a remote location where they wouldn't be easily discovered. The graves were only about 15 feet from the highway shoulder, but in the 1970s, that section of Highway 49 had been narrower and the shoulder was closer to the tree line. The graves would have been just inside the wooded area, not visible from the road, hidden by brush and vegetation. It wasn't until our road widening project in 1988, more than a decade later, that the graves were uncovered. Investigators looked into serial killers active in California during the 1970s. There were several, and some had operated in the Gold Country region, but without more specific evidence connecting the Highway 49 murders to any known killer. It was impossible to make a definitive link. They interviewed people who'd lived along Highway 49 in the late 1970s, asking if anyone remembered suspicious activity, transient young people, vehicles parked in unusual locations. Most people's memories from a decade earlier were vague. A few recalled seeing hitchhikers occasionally, but that was common in the 70s. Nobody remembered anything specific that might relate to Carla Mills and her unknown companion. The case gradually went cold. The male's remains were buried in a Mariposa County cemetery with a marker reading, "Unknown man, found June 1988. Carla's remains were returned to her family. Her aunt made arrangements for cremation and burial in Fresno. The investigation remained officially open, but without significant leads or new evidence, there wasn't much to pursue. The Mariposa County Sheriff's Department periodically reviewed the case, especially when new missing persons reports from the 1970s surfaced or when other similar murders were discovered, but nothing ever connected definitively to the Highway 49 case. Then, in the early 2000s, DNA technology had advanced enough that investigators decided to extract DNA from both sets of remains. The DNA profiles were entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, and compared against profiles from missing persons cases nationwide. The DNA testing confirmed what had been suspected. Carla Mills and the unknown male were not related. They weren't siblings or cousins. They'd been traveling together or had met shortly before being killed. But the male's DNA didn't match any missing persons profiles in the system. Either he'd never been reported missing, or his case file didn't include DNA samples, or the samples that existed weren't in the database. Without a match, his identity remained unknown. By then, 20 years had passed since the discovery of the remains. Most of the people who might have known something, potential witnesses who'd been in the area in the late 1970s, people who might have seen Carla or the male in the days before their deaths, were either deceased, had moved away, or couldn't remember details from so long ago. I retired from Caltrans in 2005 after 33 years of service. I'm 79 years old now. Living in Modesto, California, I've worked dozens of highway projects, moved thousands of tons of earth and rock, built infrastructure that millions of people use every day. But the Highway 49 project in 1988 stands out. I can still see Eddie's excavator uncovering those bones, still remember the sick feeling in my stomach when I realized we'd found human remains. Over the years, I've thought a lot about Carla Mills and the unknown young man buried with her. I've imagined their last days. Two young people in their early 20s, probably excited about the freedom and adventure of traveling through California in the summer of 1977. Maybe they were in love. Maybe they were just friends traveling together. Maybe they'd only recently met. They should have had long lives ahead of them. Instead, they encountered someone evil, someone who saw them as vulnerable, as easy targets, as people who wouldn't be missed, someone who killed them and buried them alongside a highway, confident they'd never be found. That person got away with it. They lived with that secret for however many years they survived. Maybe they're dead now, having gotten away with murder, or maybe they're still alive, an old man carrying the memory of what he did in 1977. Either way, they were never caught, never held accountable, never punished for taking two young lives. The Highway 49 case has been featured occasionally in true crime publications and local news retrospectives. Carla Mills' story, the young woman who left home after high school graduation and was never seen again until her bones were discovered 11 years later, has a tragic poignancy that resonates with people. But the unknown male remains just that, unknown. He was somebody's son, possibly somebody's brother or friend. He had a life, a history, a name, and yet we don't know who he was. He's buried in Mariposa County as unknown man, and unless new evidence emerges or DNA technology advances enough to build a genealogical family tree that identifies him, he'll likely remain unknown forever. That's the lasting frustration of the case. We identified one victim but not the other. We know they were murdered but not by whom. We found their remains but not justice. The Mariposa County Sheriff's Department still maintains the case file. Periodically, a detective will review it, check for new DNA matches, follow up if any new information comes in. But realistically, after 36 years, the chances of solving the case are slim. The killer is likely dead, witnesses are gone, and the physical evidence has been exhausted. What I can do is remember that in June 1988, we uncovered two young people who'd been buried and forgotten for over a decade. Remember that Carla Mills left Fresno in 1977 with dreams and plans that were cut short by violence. Remember that somewhere, an unknown young man deserves to have his name back, to be mourned by whatever family he had, to be known as more than just unknown man. That's all any of us can offer now. Memory, acknowledgement, and the refusal to let these victims be completely forgotten. It's not justice, not closure, but it's something. And for two young people buried beside Highway 49, maybe being remembered is at least a start. Carla Mills and her unknown companion mattered. Their lives had value. Their deaths deserve to be acknowledged and remembered. And as long as there are people willing to tell their story, they won't be completely lost to time. That's my promise to them, to remember, to honor, and to keep hoping that someday, somehow, the unknown man will get his name back and both victims will finally receive the justice they deserve. It's been 36 years and I'm running out of time myself, but I'll keep that promise for as long as I'm able. They were real, they mattered, and they won't be forgotten. That's the least we owe them, and it's the best I can give.